really gross. Up next, we have Robert Loerzel. Robert is a freelance journalist whose stories have appeared on WBEZ and publications including The Reader, Chicago Magazine, and Crane's Chicago Business. He's the author of Alchemy of Bones, Chicago's Lootgert murder case of 1897. Apologies to the Lootgert for murdering their name as well as them. And he's been working for the past decade on another book about Chicago at the turn of the 20th century. He will be reading about Lakeview. Thank you.
Before Lakeview was a Chicago neighborhood, it was a separate city. Chicago swallowed it up in 1889. Even back then, the east part of Lakeview was ritzy, but as you went further west, the neighborhood got rougher. German and Polish factory workers and laborers lived in that part of Lakeview. This was a section stretching west from Southport to the Chicago River, south of Belmont. Here's how the Chicago Tribune described this area in 1903. It is that strange, wild quarter of the city, the vicinity of the old garbage dump and the clay holes in which lives were mysteriously lost. It is that part of the city where houses of shambling pattern are set down sparsely amid dreary stretches of prairie and vacant blocks, where rough deeds are a common occurrence. The Daily News said the neighborhood was, quote, at once black and ferocious, unquote. Sometimes people call this neighborhood the Clay Holes. For years, brickmakers had been digging clay out of the ground. In the 1890s, more people were moving into the area, and they complained about the smoke from the brick factories. The kilns started shutting down as the clay got used up. But those holes were still there. The deepest went 80 feet down into the earth. Ice-cold water from underground springs trickled into the bottoms of these holes. Companies started selling the ice. In the winter, local boys skated on the ponds. In the summer, they swam in them. Some of them floated in ramshackle vessels they constructed with scraps of lumber. In 2 years, 15 people drowned. Most of them were young boys. The clays were also filling up with trash. In those days, the city relied on a loose system of private scavengers to get rid of its garbage. These haulers dumped mounds of filth into the pits of Lakeview. And I'm going to pause here for a second. I did bring a visual aid. I'm not sure how well everyone's going to be able to see this map. To give you an idea of the area that I'm talking about. I hesitated to call it Lakeview because it's really sort of a section of Lakeview. Belmont at the top here, going all the way down to Fullerton, so technically some of this would be Lincoln Park. And I pieced together these fire insurance maps from the 1890s. This green area there was apparently a farm or vacant land, and all these other areas that I've colored in were brick yards, ponds, and garbage dumps. So you can see there are about something like 10, 12 square blocks in this area. I'll pass this around. One of these dumps was near Wellington and Roby Street. Roby was what Damon Avenue was called in those days. Every day, 50 to 100 wagons arrived pouring garbage out of every type. Animal corpses lay rotting in the sun. Neighbors said the fumes were sickening. They suspected that several people had died from the germs floating in the air. Wagons came from the produce and meat markets, dumping out rotten fruit, spoiled chickens, tainted meat, and feathers. The dump owners weren't allowed to put human excrement in the clay pits, but neighbors swore that they could smell shit. Clouds of flies darkened the skies. Children traipsed through the dumps on their way to school, pulling out bottles and pieces of iron so they could sell them to junk dealers. When the garbage wagons arrived early each morning, women and children were waiting. Sometimes they fought one another with hose as they scrambled to grab rags, bottles, and rubber shoes out of the latest rubbish. They could make $2 or $3 a day selling this junk. Some pickers got down on all fours. Women looked for bits of coal to heat their homes. A reporter who visited the dumps one day described, quote, a wild and repulsive crew of weather-beaten hags and impish children scrambling through the trash one morning. A wagon filled with boxes of rotten oranges arrived. The driver tossed the foul-smelling fruit into the hole, and children eagerly seized the oranges and devoured them at once. 400 wagons full of garbage arrived every day at this particular dump, which covered 4 or 5 acres. The man watching over it all was named Clem Alexander, and he looked like a swarthy sea dog. Clem yelled, "Drop it," when he saw pickers trying to grab metal, rags, bottles, or bones as they were being dumped out of a wagon. Clem's had dibs on this stuff. He was paying city officials $5 a week for the privilege of getting the first pick. The reporter who was watching all this commented, "In this clay hole district, poverty, filth, and crime constitute an unholy triple alliance." Neighbors complained, but the dumps festered for years. A local alderman, William Schlake, promised to stop garbage from being dumped, but he did nothing to stop it, even though his own house was next door to a dump. People said he'd been paid off. In 1898, an outbreak of typhoid was blamed on a dump near Ashland Avenue, which operated day and night, illuminated by electric lights during the dark hours. Horses walked on planks across the garbage as they pulled in more wagons filled with rubbish. The Tribune reported, quote, "The soft, spongy soil has become impregnated with ooze and slime from decaying animal and vegetable matter, and the atmosphere above is heavy with malodorous and sickening vapors, which are carried by the wind to schools, residences, and business houses within a radius of more than a mile." Unquote. Another newspaper, the Chicago Eagle, blamed the situation on corrupt city officials and inspectors, accusing them of taking bribes from garbage haulers and dump owners. Thanks to these bribes, the newspaper said, quote, "They can dump the swill where they want to and poison the air as much as they like." In 1898, the city council voted to end the dumping of garbage in clay holes and vacant lots. But the city still didn't have any other system in place for trash removal, so the dumping continued. A local barber said, "What's the use of saying anything about it? We can't stop it." In 1906, the city finally created a more formal system of getting rid of garbage, signing a contract with a company that incinerated the stuff. By this time, the holes of Lakeview were filling up. Covered up with a thin layer of dirt, the dumps became vacant lots. The unstable ground wasn't always suitable for constructing buildings. It was said that poisonous gas wafted out of the soil. A neighbor said, quote, "The manure breaks into spontaneous combustion, and for weeks the garbage will burn with the smoke and the stench that is intolerable." In 1908 and 1909, hundreds of people in the neighborhood signed petitions and letters asking for a park. They said children might become better citizens if they had a decent place to play. The Lincoln Park Commission bought 8 acres at the northwest corner of Wellington and Damon, transforming one of the old dumps into Hamlin Park, which is still there today. The other dumps were eventually covered over with parking lots and buildings and grass. As you go around this section of Lakeview today, you'll see no clues that it was ever strewn with trash. It's a prosperous, gentrified neighborhood, and it's exceedingly clean.